No Story by O. Henry. The conversation I'm going to tell you about took place in the reporter's room of the Morning Beacon. I was doing some work for this newspaper. I wrote about anything I could see in New York City during my long walks about its streets. I had very little money because I had no regular work. One day Tripp came in and stopped at my table. Tripp was working in the printing department. I think he had something to do with pictures, because he always smelled of photographs chemical, and his hands were always tanned and burned with acid. He was about 25 but looked 40. Half of his face was covered with short red beard, which looks like a doormat. He looked pale, miserable, and unhealthy. He always borrowed money from all of us. He asked for a small sum, from 25 cents to $1. $1 was his limit. He knew that nobody would give him more than $1. He sat on my table, holding one hand with the other with difficulty. But it was no use. Both hands were shaking. Whiskey. That day I had got 5 new silver dollars as an advance on a story I was writing for the paper. So I was feeling at peace with the world. "Well, Tripp," said I, looking up at him, "how are you?" "Have you got $1?" asked Tripp. He was looking more miserable than ever. "I have," said I. And again I said, "I have $5 in fact, and I got them with great difficulty, I can tell you. And I'm very glad I got them because I need them very much." I was afraid he would ask me to give him $1, so I made everything clear. "I don't want to borrow any money," said Tripp, and I was glad to hear those words. "I can give you some facts for a story, and you can write it up and get a lot of money. It will make an interesting story. It will cost you $1 or $2 to get the facts for the story, but I don't want any money for myself." "What are the facts?" I asked him. "I will tell you," said Tripp. "It's a girl, a beauty. You have never seen a girl like her. She is a flower. She has lived in a village for 20 years and never saw New York City before. I met her on 34th Street. I tell you, she is the most beautiful girl in the world. She stopped me in the street and asked me where she could find George Brown. Asked me where she could find George Brown in New York City. What do you think of that? I talked to her and found out that she was going to marry a young farmer named Hiram Todd next week. But she cannot forget her first love, George Brown. George left his village some years ago and came to the city to make his fortune. But he forgot to go back to his village. So after some time she agreed to marry Hiram Todd. And now, a few days before the wedding, Ada, her name is Ada Lowery, suddenly went to the railroad station and took the train for New York City. She is looking for her George. You understand, woman, I hope. George wasn't there, so she wanted him. Well, I couldn't leave her in the streets of New York. She was sure that the first person she asked about George Brown would say, "George Brown? Let me see. Is he a short man with light blue eyes? Yes? Then you will find him out on 125th Street, a little way from the bakery. Do you see what a child she is? A beautiful child. But you must see her." What could I do? Trip continued. I never have money in the morning, and she has paid the last cent for her railroad ticket. So I took her to the boarding house on 32nd Street where I used to live. I left her there. We shall have to pay $1 for her room. That is the price per day. I will show you the house. I was angry. What are you talking about, Trip? I said. I thought you had facts for a story. Every train brings in or takes out hundreds of young girls. What kind of story can I make out of this? I'm sorry, you didn't see that an interesting story you could write, said Trip. You could describe the beauty of the girl, you could write about true love. Well, you know how to do it. I'm sure you could get $15 for the story, and it will cost you only $4. How will it cost me $4? I asked him. $1 for the room, and $2 to pay for the girl's ticket home. And the fourth dollar? $1 to me, said Trip, for whiskey. Do you agree? I didn't answer him, but only smiled and began reading again. You don't understand, said Trip, looking more miserable than before. This girl must be sent home today. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but today. I can't do anything for her. I thought you could make a newspaper story out of it and get some money for it. But no matter, whether you want to write the story or not, she must get back home before night. And then I began to feel sorry for the girl. I knew that my $3 would be spent on Ada Lowry. But I promised myself that Trip wouldn't get his dollar for whiskey. Very angry, I put my coat and hat. It took us half an hour to get to the boarding house. Trip rang the bell. Give me $1, quick, he said. A woman opened the door a little. Trip gave her the dollar without a word, and she let us in. She is the parlor, said the woman, turning her back on us. In the dark parlor, a girl was sitting at a table. She was crying. Yes, she was a beauty. Crying had only made her beautiful eyes brighter. Miss Lowry, this is my friend, Mr. Chalmers, said Trip. He looked like a beggar in his old coat, and I was ashamed when he called me his friend. My friend, said Trip again, will tell you, Miss Lowry, the same that I did. He is the reporter, and he can talk better than I can. That's why I have brought him here. He is a very clever man. He will tell you what is the best thing to do. Miss Lowry, I began and stopped. I didn't know what to say. I shall be glad to help you, of course, but first tell me your story, please. It's the first time I have ever been to New York, said the girl. I had no idea that it was such a big place, and I met Mr. Flip in the street and asked him about a friend of mine, and he brought me here and asked me to wait. I advise you, Miss Lowry, said Trip, to tell you Mr. Chalmers all. He is a friend of mine, and he will tell you what to do. Why, of course, said Adam. There is nothing to tell, only that I was going to marry Hiram Dodd next Thursday evening. He was got 200 acres of land and one of the best farms in our village. But this morning I told my mother that I was going to spend the day with Susie Adams. It was a lie, of course, but I don't care. And I came to New York by train, and I met Mr. Flip in the street and asked him if he knew where I could find George. Miss Lowery, Tripp stopped her. You told me that you liked this young man, Hiram Dodd. You also told me that he was in love with you and was very good to you. Of course I like him, said Miss Lowery. And of course he is going good to me. Everybody is good to me. Of course all men were good to Ada. I was sure that men would always be good to her. She was so beautiful. But, continued Miss Lowery, last night I began to think about George and she began to cry again. Such a beautiful spring storm. I was sorry that I couldn't be of great help to her. I wasn't George, and I wasn't glad that, and I was not Hiram. I was glad and sorry at the same time. By and by the storm passed. She smiled and went on with her story. George Brown and I were in love with each other since he was 8 and I was 5. Then he was 19. That was 4 years ago. He left our village and went to the city. He said he was going to be a policeman or a president of a railroad company or something like that. He promised to come back for me. But I have never heard from him anymore, and I liked him. She was going to cry again, but then Tripp said quickly to me, Mr. Chalmers, can you tell the lady what is the best thing to do now? Miss Lowery, said I, life is hard for all of us. We seldom marry those whom the first love. You say that Mr. Dodd is very good to you and that you like him. I'm sure you will be happy when you marry him. Yes, said Miss Lowery, I can get along with him. He promised me an automobile and a motorboat, and still, when the time of our wedding was so close, I began thinking about George. I know he doesn't write me because something bad has happened to him. On the day he left, he and I got a hammer and chisel and cut a dime into 2 pieces. I took one piece and he took the other. We promised to be true to each other and always keep the pieces till we meet again. I keep my piece at home. I see now that it was silly to come up here looking for him. I didn't know what a big place it is. Tripp laughed. I saw he was trying to be of help in order to get his whiskey dollar. Oh, he said, the boys from the country forget their girls when they come to the city. I'm afraid he is in love with another girl now. Or maybe he has gone to the dogs because of whiskey. You listen to Mr. Chalmers and go home and everything will be all right. At last she agreed to go home. The 3 of us went to the station. The price of the ticket to her village was only $1.80. I bought the ticket and also a red rose for Miss Lowery. We said goodbye to her. It was over at last. Tripp and I looked at each other. He looked more miserable than ever. Can you make a story out of it? He asked. Not a line, said I. There is nothing interesting in all this. But we should be glad that we have helped the little girl. That's all. I'm sorry, said Tripp softly. I'm sorry you've had to spend money. Let's try to forget it, said I. I wasn't going to give him $1 for whiskey. Trip unbuttoned his coat to take a handkerchief out of his pocket. As he did so, Anati's sheep was chained across his waist. Something was hanging from the chain. I took it in my hand. It was half of a dime. It had been cut in halves with chisel. What? I said, looking at him in surprise. Oh, yes, he answered softly. George Brown. Now, Trip. What's the use? I took $1 out of my pocket and put it into Trip's hands.